All right. So one of the things that takes place is that, as we talked about, there's a problem that Israel experiences, and the problem is that without a king, everyone's kind of doing their own thing. Everybody's doing what they see fit, and that leads to a number of very dark episodes in Israel's history. And so one of the things that they do is they cry out for a king, and the first king that they get is Saul. And when you look at Saul and his qualifications for being king, what is it that people see in Saul that leads them to believe that he's going to be a good king?
They see physical strength. They see it seems like he's a head taller than, most other men and things of his sort. And honestly, I don't know how much they see beyond that. But I mean, early on, he seems he's filled with the Spirit, and he goes out and seems to lead okay, in the very initial times. But
Okay.
It definitely doesn't last.
Now the question that arises often is that why would God give them a king when he didn't seem to want to give them a king? What is it? What's God doing here in going ahead and saying, okay, here's Saul, he's going to be your king?
Oftentimes, you can take path A or path B. And the problem is, if you take path A, you never get to see the what if had you taken path B. And I wonder if God's kind of letting them see, well, this is what you wanted. And unless you actually experience it, you won't see the disadvantages of it either.
I guess the other question we could ask is why is God against giving them a king?
Well, God says, through Samuel that he's supposed to be their king, and the idea is that, they're all supposed to be kings in a sense of their own domains and what they've been given authority over and stuff, and supposed to make those things fruitful. But if you actually have this king over the land like Saul, God's pretty clear and says, look, he's going to take a tenth of everything, and he's going to, subject, your strongest boys to the army and things of this sort. And there's going to be a real substantial cost to this that you didn't have.
So what do you think the Israelites' hope is in getting a king? Because they're clamoring for a king, and they say, all the other nations have a king. Give us a king. Why can't we have a king? And so God says, okay, I'll give you a king. What do you think their hope is in getting a king?
No, they want a hero. They want a savior in a sense. From the Philistines and some of the other peoples in the region and stuff like that, who they've been subjected to over and over, and they want salvation from those things, from those people.
Okay, so they're looking for salvation in a physical sense and not in a spiritual sense. Rather than have a spiritual king in God, they're looking for a physical king. And interestingly enough, God kind of plays into their hand and God often teaches us by giving us what we want. And so he gives them this physical king, but he also gives them a king that physically looks like the kind of king that they would want. He kind of goes, okay, well, if you want to go down this path, we'll go down this path. And if it's a physical king you want, I'm going to give you a very physical person as king. So Saul has some very physical qualities that might lead us to believe he would make a good king, but he's missing some spiritual qualities that become very important later on in the story. What are some of those spiritual qualities that Paul's missing, or Saul, excuse me, wrong guy?
Obviously he's given into some pride later on and stuff like this, but he also, in the midst of a difficult situation, rather than trusting God, Samuel's supposed to show up, and Samuel's supposed to kind of bless the army and kind of lead, so they can be let out and stuff like this, and Samuel doesn't show right on time, and so Saul totally goes against, God's law and kind of assumes the role of the priest, which he is definitely not supposed to do. But he has no faith in God, so he totally does some things contrary to God's will, in the hope that he can still rally the troops, so to speak, as he's worried they were kind of abandoning him and stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting that the person that God gives to Israel is a guy who has, like Israel, has great confidence in the physical things, but very little confidence in the spiritual things. And so when he sees the army starting to kind of get restless and desert him on the eve of battle, because the prophet hasn't shown up and because they haven't been blessed, he takes it into his own hands to do this. And this is just one of a number of spiritual problems that he has. You can see later on in his life, there's this lack of faith, there's a lack of patience, there's pride, there's anger, There's an unwillingness to abide by any kind of boundary. There's just a host of problems. He looks good, but he really reflects the problems of Israel. And really, it seems like what God is doing here is he's trying to, just like the loss of the ark, he's trying to teach them a lesson about the nature of physical versus spiritual strength. What is the problem with Israel trying to rely on physical strength here, and especially what's the problem with, Israel has had this problem in their past of everyone doing what he wants because there's no king, and so they're going to use a king to use outside regulation on their behavior. And they see this as the answer. Why isn't it the answer?
Tyranny, in and of itself can accomplish something, but it will never accomplish the same degree of obedience as the desire to actually be obedient. And so having a king who's going to enforce, certain rules and stuff like this is only going to go so far. And, it's funny because physical strength, and I don't mean an individual's physical strength, but I mean the kind of strength that Israel wants right here has a spiritual foundation, and so they're trying to have it without having the spiritual foundation, and ultimately God's showing them that that's just not possible.
Right. And do you see any parallels in modern times with this desire to have kind of outside regulation be the answer for a lack of inward spiritual strength?
Oh, absolutely, and there's a huge reliance on the government to solve issues, and whether that's the government taking care of those in need, or the government curtailing emissions over here, but it's always the government, and there's a place for us to actually act and participate in this, but when there's this reliance on, well, that's what the government does, that's what they're for, and again, but we were supposed to be a nation of the people, by the people, for the people, and we forget that kind of in a sense we're supposed to be the government.
Yeah, I think that there is clearly a parable or a parallel from the 20th century onward with all the utopian visions and schemes that have come out from communism, socialism, and environmentalism, all the things, is that that somehow we can create utopia without a change of the hearts of the people, that somehow through just physical regulation, through the right government, the right laws, enough government, enough laws, that we can regulate ourselves into utopia. And really what you see is that we already have a picture of that desire in Israel, and also we have a picture of where it leads.